The rock had been there longer than anyone could remember. It sat in the southeast corner of the field, like something the earth had decided to keep for itself. A gray-brown mass, roughly the size of a small car. Its surface pocked and lichen-covered. Its edges worn smooth by rain that had fallen across more seasons than any living person on the property had witnessed. Earl Hadley had plowed around it his entire life. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. His father had plowed around it before him. His grandfather, a man who died before Earl was old enough to form a clear memory of his face, had done the same. 3 generations of Hadleys had built their furrows around that boulder, the way a river builds its path around an immovable stone, accepting its presence so completely that no one ever stopped to ask why it was there or what it had been placed on top of. Earl was 53 years old, and the land had been bleeding him dry for 11 of those years. He stood at the kitchen window most mornings before dawn, drinking coffee from a mug that had lost its handle 2 winters ago and never been replaced, watching the dark shapes of the fields resolve slowly into color as light came up over the ridge to the east. The house was quiet in those hours, a particular kind of quiet that filled spaces where other sounds used to live. His wife Karen had taken their daughter Lily to her mother's place in Billings 14 months ago. She hadn't said it was permanent when she left. She hadn't had to. The county extension office had been politely direct the last time he sat across from their representative. Soil depletion in the western parcels was severe. The wheat yields had dropped for consecutive years. At current trajectory, the operation would not be viable past another 2 growing seasons without significant capital investment. He did not have the representative had a laminated chart that made the math look clean and inevitable. The way bad news always looked better when someone put it in a graph. Earl had 3 things left: the land, the equipment, and the boulder. He hadn't thought much about selling the land. It had belonged to Hadleys since 1887, deed to his great-great-grandfather Thomas Hadley by a territorial government that considered the high plains of eastern Montana an acceptable trade for homesteading commitment. 5 generations of effort had built the property into something, and then slowly, season by season, the combination of drought cycles, falling commodity prices, and debt accumulated during the brief optimistic period, when expansion had seemed wise, had started dismantling it, the same way weather dismantles anything left too long without maintenance. The bank held a note he was behind on. The equipment dealer held a lien on the combine. His operating line of credit sat at its limit and had since March. He poured a second cup of coffee and stood at the window until the field took shape in the gray morning light. The boulder was visible even from that distance, a darker shape against the pale stubble of last year's harvested wheat. He had never once wondered about it, beyond the practical calculation of steering around it. That morning, for reasons he could not have explained clearly even to himself, he did. His neighbor, a retired geologist named Darren Puitt, who had moved to the area 10 years ago from Missoula after a career with a mining company, had mentioned the boulder once during a conversation about fence lines. He had used a word Earl didn't know: an erratic, a glacially deposited stone carried from somewhere else and left behind when the ice retreated. They were common across the northern plains, Puitt had said. Relics of a time when the landscape looked nothing like it did now. Some were worth something to collectors, most were not. Earl had nodded and moved the conversation back toward the fence line. Now he stood in his field in the early morning cold coffee mug, in his good hand, looking at the boulder with the focused attention of a man who had run out of other things to look at. It was big. He had always known it was big. But standing beside it, rather than plowing around it, gave the size a different quality. The top was roughly flat, worn level by a century, and more of exposure. Lichen grew in patterns that looked almost deliberate. There was a crack along one side, a deep vertical seam that disappeared into the ground, and the base of the stone was buried in soil that had accumulated around it across decades of field runoff. He pressed his palm against the surface. Cold, solid, old in a way that made the word feel insufficient. He thought about the extension officer's chart, about the bank's payment schedule, about Karen's voice on the phone last Sunday. Careful and neutral, in the way voices got when people were protecting themselves from something they hadn't decided yet. He thought about 340 acres of depleted topsoil and a combine with a lien on it. Then he walked back to the house, called Darren Puitt, and asked whether he would come take a look at the boulder in the southeast field. Not because he expected anything, more because standing still was no longer something he could afford. Puig arrived that afternoon in a truck that had seen harder use than Earl's. Wearing a canvas jacket with a tape measure clipped to one pocket, in a habit of walking slowly and looking at things from multiple angles before speaking, he circled the boulder twice, paused at the vertical crack, ran his hand along the base where soil met stone, and crouched to examine the ground around it. Then he stood up and squinted at it the way Earl imagined professionals squinted at things when they were deciding how much to tell you. "It's a glacial erratic," he said, which you probably figured. "But it's not limestone. That's a type of quartzite. Could be Precambrian. Might have come from somewhere in the Bear Tooth range given the mineral composition." Earl waited. Puig crouched again at the base of the stone and pointed. "You see this? The soil around the base is disturbed. Not recently, but someone worked around this stone at some point. This depression here, it's not natural. Something was dug here and then filled back in. How long ago?" Puig stood and looked at the field, then at the house in the distance. Hard to say without better tools. Decades at minimum. But somebody was interested in this stone for a reason that had nothing to do with plowing around it. Earl looked at the depression. Now that Puig pointed to it, it was obvious. A shallow oval of slightly different soil, darker with grass that grew marginally thicker than the surrounding stubble. He had looked at this corner of his field hundreds of times without seeing it. "Could be nothing," Puig said. "Somebody buried something. Somebody dug it back up. Could be an old survey marker. Could be the place an early homesteader dumped something they didn't want. Or it could be something else." Puig looked at him without expression. "Could be you want to find out you need to move the stone, or excavate around it. Either way, you're committing to significant effort for probably nothing." Earl was quiet for a moment. "Probably nothing is currently where I live, Darren. Probably nothing is what I've got." But pulled out the tape measure and extended it along the base of the boulder. "You'd need heavy equipment to move a stone this size. We're talking 10-12 tons at minimum. You know anyone with a crane rig?" "As a matter of fact," Earl said, "I do." His cousin Bobby Aldrich ran an excavation business out of Miles City and owed Earl a favor that dated back to 2009, when Earl had lent him the money to make payroll during a cash flow crisis that Bobby had never fully repaid in currency, but had acknowledged in a dozen other ways across the years. Earl called him that evening. Bobby arrived 2 days later with a flatbed carrying a crane attachment and his longtime equipment operator, a quiet man named Gus, who communicated primarily through the precision of his machine work rather than conversation. Bobby was shorter than Earl remembered. Or maybe Earl had grown in the years between seeing him clearly. He walked around the boulder 3 times with his hands in his pockets, kicked the base experimentally, and announced that moving it would be either easy or a complete disaster, depending on what the root structure looked like underneath. Earl said, "Just try not to destroy my field any worse than it already is." Bobby said he'd do his best, and Gus began rigging the crane. The whole operation drew a small crowd by mid-morning. Pochit came back with a camera. The Hendersons from the neighboring property arrived in their truck and parked at the field's edge, without being invited, which was standard practice in that part of Montana when anything out of the ordinary happened on a neighbor's land. Their teenage son, Tyler, stood in the truck bed for a better view. Earl's former farmhand, Marcus, who now worked for a operation 20 miles north, but had heard about it from someone at the grain elevator, pulled up just before noon. Even Earl's brother-in-law, a man named Phil, who had vocally considered Earl's farm a lost cause for years and had told Karen as much in front of their daughter, drove out from town and leaned against his car with his arms crossed, in a posture that suggested he had come to observe failure rather than witness anything hopeful. Gus ran the crane's hook down and worked with Bobby to thread the lifting straps around the base of the boulder where the soil had been removed. It took almost 2 hours of careful digging, repositioning, and retesting before Bobby was satisfied with the configuration. The crane engine deepened in pitch as Gus began applying pressure. The boulder did not move at first. Then a sound came from the ground, not a crack or a groan, but something lower and more unsettling. The noise of something that had been held in place for a very long time beginning to release its grip. Soil shifted around the base. The lichen-covered surface tilted slightly. Then the stone came up slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, swinging clear of the hole it had occupied for longer than anyone present had been alive. Gus set it down 12 feet away, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with its weight. Earl walked to the edge of the hole. He had expected dirt, maybe an old glass bottle or a fence post anchor, buried by some previous occupant. He had prepared himself in the careful way people prepare themselves for things they believe probably won't matter for nothing. What he saw instead stopped him at the edge of the hole and held him there while the sound of the crane engine faded into background and the conversations around him fell away one by one until the field was quiet. At the bottom of the excavated space, partially exposed by the removal of the stone and the soil that had settled around it across decades, was the top of a structure, not natural stone, not a buried fence post or old machinery. It was constructed heavy timber and dressed stone, the kind of deliberate craftsmanship that took time and intention, and suggested that whoever built it had expected it to last. A door in the ground, sealed and framed and fitted with iron hardware that had oxidized to deep rust, but remained structurally intact, set into a frame of hand-hewn wood that showed no signs of rot despite its age. Bobby came up beside him and was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said, "that's not nothing." Darren Pewitt leaned over from the other side and said very quietly that the timber work looked consistent with late 19th century construction, which meant it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it before the automobile existed. Phil from 15 feet back said it was probably an old root cellar and not worth getting excited about. Earl was not thinking about Phil. He was thinking about Thomas Hadley, his great-great-grandfather, who had taken possession of this land in 1887 and built the original homestead house, now long collapsed out of lumber, hauled in by wagon. He was thinking about the stories that had been told, and then quietly stopped being told, the way family stories sometimes did, when the people who knew their full context died and took the context with them. He was thinking about a drawer in his kitchen where he kept old documents that had come down through the property, land patents and letters, and a few photographs so faded they showed only outlines. He was thinking about a line in one of those letters he had read once and have forgotten, written by Thomas Hadley to his brother in 1899. Something about keeping certain things safe in the old way. Something about a promise made to people who needed trust more than money. He had read it as the ordinary vague language of a man writing to family, the kind of thing that meant everything to its writer and nothing to readers who came later without the shared knowledge to decode it. He looked at the door in the ground. He looked at the boulder now, sitting 12 feet away, its bottom surface revealed for the first time in a century or more. There were marks on the underside, not natural marks, lines and a crosscut deliberately into the stone at its center, the kind of marking that looked like a surveyor's point, or a grave marker, or a sign left for someone who would know what it meant. He climbed down into the hole. The door handle was iron forged rather than cast, thick and cold and solid in his hand when he closed his fingers around it. He cleared soil from the edges of the frame with his hands, then borrowed Gus's pry bar and worked it into the seam. The wood had swollen over the years, and the fit was tighter than it would have been originally. But the hardware held, and the frame held, and after several minutes of careful pressure, the door released its seal with a sound that was not dramatic, just final. The quiet exhalation of something that had been closed long enough. Stale air moved past him, cool and dry, carrying a smell that was old without being unpleasant, a mineral smell, like deep stone. The space below was dark. Earl turned to Bobby and said, "Go get the flashlights out of my truck." He stood at the top of a narrow wooden staircase, descending into ground that had not been open to air since before his grandfather's grandfather was a young man, and he felt something he had not felt in years. Not hope exactly, not yet. Something under hope, the condition that makes hope possible. A crack in the certainty that nothing would change. Bobby handed him a flashlight. Pewitt was already halfway down into the hole, camera in hand, unable to contain professional curiosity. The Hendersons' boy, Tyler, had somehow gotten to the edge and was standing there with his mouth open. Even Phil had left his car and was moving closer, arms no longer crossed. Earl went down the stairs. They were solid. Each tread had been notched into heavy side beams, and the wood, though, showed no give under his weight. The staircase was narrow, but not cramped, and it descended at a shallow angle for roughly 12 feet before the flashlight beam found a floor. A floor of dressed stone laid in regular courses, fitted without mortar, in a technique that was older than mortar, and outlasted it in dry conditions. The walls were the same dressed stone, set with the care of someone who had done this before, or learned from someone who had. The ceiling was timbered, heavy beams carrying the weight of the earth above, still intact. The room was roughly 30 feet long and 15 wide, larger than he had expected, much larger than a root cellar would need to be. It was not empty. Shelving ran along both long walls, constructed from the same heavy timber as the staircase, and the shelving held objects in a density that took his eyes several seconds to begin sorting into categories. Wooden crates, some open, some sealed. Canvas bags stiffened with age but intact, ceramic jugs with wax-sealed stoppers, metal boxes of varying sizes, their surfaces oxidized but structurally sound, wrapped bundles that he could not immediately identify, more wooden crates stacked in the center of the room, the largest nearly to his chest. Puiki came down the stairs behind him and made a sound that was barely a word. Earl moved to the nearest open crate and directed his flashlight into it. The crate held bottles, dark glass, sealed with cork and wax in the style of the late 1800s. Some had labels still partially legible. He recognized the format of old patent medicine bottles, but these were different in proportion, and the label fragments suggested something other than medicine. He was not sure what. The crate beside it was closed. He pried at the lid with the flat of his hand until it gave, and looked in at neat rows of small cloth bags, each tied closed with twine. He opened the nearest bag. Coins, old coins, heavier than modern currency, their surfaces oxidized but present. He picked one up and held it under the flashlight. The impression was still clear enough to read. Liberty, 1879. Bobby, who had come down behind Puit, said something that Earl didn't fully register. He set the coin down carefully and moved to the next crate. This one held paper, documents rolled and tied with twine, or folded into envelopes sealed with wax, the kind of official-looking paperwork that suggested legal records or correspondence. He did not open these. He set the crate to one side with careful deliberateness, aware that he was in the presence of something that required care. He was not equipped to provide with his bare hands in a hole in the ground. The canvas bags along the wall were the ones that changed his understanding of the room's scale. He pressed the nearest one between his palms, feeling for content through the stiffened fabric, and the weight and density told him something dense and metal. He worked open the top and shone his light inside. Gold. Not processed gold, not jewelry. Raw, irregular nuggets, and dust packed into the bag with the practical efficiency of someone who valued the material and understood its weight. He stood with the bag in his hands and turned slowly, counting the bags on the shelving. 15 more behind those. The shelf ran the full length of the wall. Darren Puit, who had spent 30 years working for a mining company and had a precise and professional relationship with the site of ore, was standing very still beside the center crates, with an expression that Earl had never seen on a man that composed. He said, "Earl, I need you to understand what you're looking at here." Earl said he was working on it. Puit said he thought the visible raw gold alone, based on rough estimation of volume and standard gold content of alluvial material from this region, was worth several $1 million at current prices. But he said it in a voice that suggested the raw gold was not the most significant thing in the room, which meant the most significant thing in the room was something had seen, and Earl had not yet found. Earl turned against the far wall. Half hidden behind the largest of the center crates were 4 objects he had initially categorized as large ceramic storage jars. He walked to them and crouched, and the flashlight showed him that they were not ceramic. They were iron, cast iron, sealed with iron lids that had been fastened with hasps. Each hasp padlocked with locks that had frozen solid with rust but were still closed. He could not open them with what he had. But Puit crouched beside him and pointed to the sides of the nearest one, where faint lettering had been cast into the metal as part of its original manufacturer. He angled the flashlight and read the words slowly, one at a time, as though the space between them mattered. United States Assay Office, Denver, Colorado. He looked at Puit. Puit said very quietly, "These are office containers. They were used to transport refined gold and silver between federal mints and assay offices during the territorial period. They held processed bars, not raw ore. Each container typically held between 40 and 80 pounds of refined material, depending on the denomination." He paused. "There are 4 of them." Earl sat back on his heels in the dirt of a room that had been sealed since before anyone still living had drawn a breath, in the corner of a field that 3 generations of Hadleys had plowed around without knowing what sat beneath its most stubborn obstacle, and tried to hold the dimensions of what he was sitting inside, without his thinking simply coming apart. His phone had no signal underground. He climbed back up the stairs above ground. Phil was standing at the edge of the hole in the posture of a man who had been about to offer another dismissive comment and had seen something on Earl's face when he came up that made him go quiet instead. The Hendersons' boy Tyler was sitting on the boulder with his phone out. Marcus was leaning against Bobby's truck with his hat in his hand. Earl stood in the open field in the late afternoon light and looked at his land, at the soil he had been trying to coax productivity from for 11 years, at the sky that was going golden orange over the western ridge, and he thought about Thomas Hadley, who had built a door in the ground and put a boulder on top of it and then never told anyone why. Or perhaps he had told someone. Perhaps the telling had gotten lost in the way that things got lost across generations, when the people who held knowledge didn't understand that the knowledge needed specific words to survive. He called Karen from Bobby's phone. She picked up on the second ring and he said, "I need you to listen to me. I found something under the boulder." She was quiet on the other end, and he said, "I'm not sure yet exactly what it is, but I think you should come back." And he said, "I think things are going to change." She asked him what he meant by change, and he found that he could not say it in a way that wouldn't sound like the wishful thinking she had heard too many times across too many difficult years. So he said, "I need a historian and an appraiser and probably a lawyer and a geologist, and I need them before anyone else finds out what's down there." He paused. "Also, I love you, and I should have said that more when I had nothing to say it against." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she would drive up in the morning. He spent the night sitting at the kitchen table with the drawer open beside him, the one that held the old documents and letters, reading through them with attention he had never previously applied, because he had never previously had a reason to. Most of it was ordinary land patent numbers, records of livestock purchase, a letter from his great-great-grandmother to a relative that described weather and harvest in the practical terms of people who lived close to both. Then he found the letter he half remembered. It was from Thomas Hadley to his brother James, dated October 1901. The handwriting was difficult, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write without much instruction, and did it anyway. Letters of varying size and uneven spacing across paper that had gone yellow and brittle at the edges. Earl read it slowly, going back over passages that his eyes couldn't parse the first time. Thomas Hadley wrote about the harvest. He wrote about a neighbor's child who had been ill. He wrote about the weather coming early that year. Then in the middle of a paragraph that began with the practical note that he was thinking about putting in a new well on the north end, he wrote the following: "The understanding we came to with the men from the settlement remains. I have kept what they left in the place we agreed upon under the marker we chose together, and it will remain there until there is need, or until the right knowing passes to someone who understands why it was kept. I will not write more than this. Some things keep better in silence, but I want someone in the family to know it exists, even if they don't know the rest, because things that are forgotten entirely become as though they never happened, and these men trusted us with something that deserved to be remembered." Earl read the paragraph 3 times. Then he sat with the letter in his hands and thought about what the men from the settlement meant, and who they might have been, and what kind of trust required the weight of a boulder for its safekeeping. He did not sleep that night. He went out to the field at 3 o'clock in the morning and stood beside the open hole with a flashlight in his hand. The night was clear, cold stars sharp and near the way they were in that country, when the atmosphere cooperated with the desire to see clearly. He shone the light down into the staircase, not to go down, just to confirm that it was still there, that the contents were still where they had been, that he had not somehow dreamed the afternoon. The iron containers sat in the far corner of the room, exactly where Puig had identified them. The canvas bags lined the shelving exactly as they had. The crates and the documents and the ceramic jugs and the metal boxes held their positions in the underground room where they had waited, sealed, and patient for longer than the oldest living thing on his property had been alive. He thought about the men from the settlement. He thought about trust that required a boulder. He stood in his field in the dark and felt the particular weight of having been handed something that was bigger than he was, and that he had not asked for, but now had to carry. He thought about his daughter Lily, who was 9 years old, and had not had an easy 9 years because her parents had been too worried about money to protect her from the noise that made. He thought about Karen, who had not left because she stopped loving him, but because she had run out of room to hope in a house that felt like it was slowly closing in. He thought about Thomas Hadley, who had done something in 1901 that he left as a letter rather than a conversation, trusting that someone downstream would be able to read the silence between the words. He was that someone. The responsibility of it sat on him the way the boulder had sat on that corner of his field, heavy and immovable, and older than he was. But it did not feel like a burden. It felt like an inheritance, not of money, though that was part of it, but of trust, the particular kind that requires silence and years, and the patience of stone. He went back inside before dawn and started the coffee. The morning came gray and cold, a low sky that promised nothing, the kind of day the plane specialized in, when they wanted to remind you that they had no particular interest in being encouraging. Earl drove the farm truck out to the field gate and padlocked it closed after running a strand of old wire across the path, a rough barrier that would slow down anyone who happened by and might wonder what the crane was doing parked in the middle of a wheat field. Puitz arrived early, before Earl had finished his second cup, with two people he had called from his previous professional life. A retired assayer named Helen Marsh, who now consulted on estate valuations, and a man named Victor Chu, who had done archival work for the State Historical Society and could read documents that other people couldn't parse. Bobby had stayed the night in his truck, an act of loyalty so matter-of-fact that Earl didn't know how to respond to it, except to bring him coffee and 2 pieces of toast. Karen arrived at 10:30 in a car that Earl didn't recognize, rental probably from the airport. She walked across the field without saying anything and stood at the edge of the hole and looked down. She looked at Earl. He could not read her expression, which meant it held too many things to be reduced to one. She said, "How long has this been here?" "At least since 1901, he said. "Probably longer." She was quiet. Then she said, "You should have moved that rock 11 years ago." He almost laughed. It felt strange in his chest, the nearly laugh like a muscle that had not been used in too long. He said, "Yeah, probably." She took his hand, and they stood at the edge of the hole together, while Helen Marsh descended the stairs with her equipment, and Victor Chu followed with cotton gloves and document boxes, and the focused attention of someone for whom old paper was a different kind of treasure than metal. Phil arrived uninvited at noon, having apparently told no one about the previous day's discovery, because his manner was still the same calculated skepticism it always was, which suggested he had not understood what he'd seen. He took one look at Helen Marsh's face when she came back up the stairs, and seemed to recalibrate something in his thinking. "What exactly is down there?" he asked. Earl said, "We don't know the full picture yet." This was technically true, and he kept it that way. Helen Marsh had been doing this for 30 years, which meant she had the capacity to be professionally calm about things that would be dramatic news to everyone else. She sat at the folding table, had set up at the field's edge, and wrote in a notebook with the systematic thoroughness of someone building a record rather than telling a story. She said, "The gold, dust, and nuggets in the canvas bags represent significant value. I can't give you a firm number without proper weighing and assay, but based on visual estimation, I would put the total raw gold content somewhere in the range of 200 to 300,000 troy ounces." Earl sat across from her. He was not sure he heard the number correctly. She said it again without being asked, looking at his face. At current gold prices, she said that translates to a range of roughly $360 to $550 million for the raw material alone, before processing costs and assuming standard alluvial content ratios. She paused. The force seal to say office containers are a different matter. I cannot confirm their contents without opening them, which will require a specific process to do without damage. But if they contain what the markings suggest, which is refined gold bars from the federal assay period, the historical and monetary value is significantly higher. Refined bars from that era in original federal containers are extraordinarily rare collector's items. The premium above metal value can be substantial. She wrote something in her notebook. She said, "There are also the documents which Victor is cataloging," she said, "and the patent medicine bottles, which may not be medicine. I'll need to examine those separately, and there are items on the shelving we haven't fully inventoried yet." Earl looked at Karen. Karen looked at the field. She said quietly, so only he could hear, "Does this mean we can fix the combine?" He said, "I think we can probably buy a new combine." She laughed. It was a real laugh, unexpected, and the sound of it in that flat gray field on a cold morning was the best thing he had heard in a long time. She pressed her hand over her mouth like she was embarrassed by it, then took it down and let the laugh go where it went, out across the stubble and the turned earth and the open hole where a century of patience had kept its promise. Victor Chu came up from the stairs with cotton gloves on and a careful expression, and said he needed to talk to Earl about the documents. Earl left Karen at the table with Helen and walked over to where Victor stood at the edge of the hole. Victor said, "I've been doing archival work for 25 years." He said it without boasting, as a baseline for what followed. He said, "The documents in those crates represent one of the most significant collections of late 19th century land and financial records I have encountered outside of an institutional archive. There are deeds, there are legal contracts, there are transfer records and affidavit and correspondence. And there is a ledger." "What kind of ledger?" Victor looked at him steadily. "A ledger that records the contributions and deposits made to this location by a group of individuals beginning in 1887 and ending in 1903. The final entry is in a different hand than the earlier ones, which suggests the primary record keeper died and someone else completed the final notation. The ledger names contributors, dates, and amounts." He paused. "There are 41 names in this ledger, Mr. Hadley. 41 individuals or families who contributed gold, currency, and property deeds to what the ledger describes as the common holding." Earl heard Thomas Hadley's voice from the letter in his kitchen drawer. "The men from the settlement." "What settlement?" he said. Victor said, "There was a community in this county during the territorial period that is not well documented in state historical records. It appears to have been a cooperative settlement of homesteaders who pulled resources for mutual protection against land seizure by railroad interests. There are several affidavits in the documents from individuals describing attempts by agents of rail companies to purchase or seize their claims at fraudulent prices. The common holding, as the ledger calls it, was apparently created as a collective defense fund and asset reserve if enough resources were held collectively. The argument was that no single family could be pressured into selling by financial desperation." Earl thought about his own situation for a moment. The familiarity of the structure was not lost on him. Victor continued, "The holding was placed here by agreement of the community, under the guardianship of the Hadley family, as landowners of the central parcel. The final ledger entry in the second hand simply says, Thomas Hadley, keeper of the common trust, died November 1903. Guardianship passes with the land." Earl was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What happened to the settlement? The people who contributed?" Victor's expression was careful. "Most of the land in this county changed hands between 1895 and 1910. Railroad companies, then later large cattle operations, acquired most of the original homestead claims through various means, some legal, some not. The settlement as a community appears not to have survived past 1910. Individual families dispersed. Many of the contributors in the ledger are people whose descendants may not know their family had any presence in this county at all." Earl looked at the boulder now sitting 12 feet from its original position, its underside marks visible in the morning light. The cross and the surveyor's lines cut into the stone, by someone who wanted to leave a record that couldn't be moved or destroyed. He said, "These 41 families, their descendants, what are their rights to what's in that room?" Victor looked at him. Earl said, "I'm not asking what I'm legally entitled to. I'm asking what the ledger says about the terms of the holding." Victor went back down the stairs. He was down there for 20 minutes. When he came back up, he was carrying one document in his cotton-gloved hands, a single page, folded twice, the paper stiff and yellowed, but the writing clear enough to read. He held it at arm's length and read the relevant section aloud in the flat air of the field. "The common holding is placed in trust with the Hadley family of this county for safekeeping and defense. Should the need for which it was assembled no longer exist, or should no draw upon it be made for a period of 50 years, the holding shall be considered complete, and the guardianship shall end. The guardian at that time shall have full legal authority over the material, subject to such laws as then exist, but is asked by those assembled here to remember that this was built by many hands for many families, and that memory has value beyond money." Victor lowered the page. Earl looked at his field, at the combine with the lean, at the house where Karen had come back to this morning, at the ridge to the east where the light was beginning to break through the gray sky in thin horizontal bands that made the whole landscape look like it was being gradually revealed. He said, "Get me the ledger." Victor looked at him. Earl said, "I want to read every name in it." He sat at the folding table with the ledger open in front of him, cotton gloves on his own hands, at Victor's insistence, and he read through 41 names written in Thomas Hadley's careful, difficult script. Some he recognized as surnames still present in the county. Some were entirely unfamiliar. Some appeared to be families of Eastern European origin, the kind of names that showed up in this part of Montana during the homestead period, among immigrants who came to farm and were met with conditions that made farming feel like warfare. He read each name slowly and thought about what it had cost each of those people to bring what they brought to this location and trust it to someone else for safekeeping. He read the name at the top of the list, the largest single contributor, a name that Victor confirmed matched one of the land deed documents in the crates, a family that had held significant acreage in the adjacent township before losing it in the late 1890s to what the legal documents described as an irregular foreclosure proceeding. He read the entry that Thomas Hadley had made beside that name, 3 words written in the margin in a different ink, suggesting they were added later. Good people, trusted. He sat with the ledger in front of him, and the field around him, and the sky opening up slowly to the east. And he made a decision that had not required much deliberation, because the terms of the decision had been written in the room below him 120 years ago by people who understood something about the relationship between keeping faith and being worthy of it. He stood up and walked to where Karen was standing with her coffee and said, "I know what we're going to do." She looked at him. He said, "We're going to find them." She said, "Find who?" He said, "All 41 families. Whatever's left of them, the descendants of every person who put something in that room." Karen was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Earl, that's going to take a long time." He said, "I know." He said, "I've got the time." Phil, who had been hovering at the edge of close enough to overhear, said something about the practical difficulty of that kind of search and the legal complications of distribution, and the wisdom of consulting a financial advisor before making any commitments. He said it in the tone of someone who considered themselves a voice of reason in situations where emotion was governing decisions. Earl looked at him without particular expression. He said, "Phil, I appreciate you coming out." Phil said, "He was just trying to help." Earl said he knew that. Then he went back to the folding table and asked Victor Chu how to begin searching for the descendants of people whose names appeared in a Montana territorial ledger from 1887. Victor said it would be complicated. Earl said complicated was fine. He was used to complicated. Complicated was what happened when something actually mattered. The afternoon light was coming down fully now, the gray sky having given up its hold on the day, and the field looked different in that light than it had ever looked in his memory. The same soil, the same stubble, the same ridge to the east. But the scale of it was different now, because the scale of what it sat on top of was different. And some reckonings, once they start, have a way of changing the proportions of everything else. He took off the cotton gloves and handed them back to Victor. He picked up his phone, which had signal again, up here in the open air. He called his daughter. Lily picked up on the first ring the way 9-year-olds do when they see a parent's number and assume something has happened. He said, "Hey, Bug." He said, "Nothing's wrong." He said, "I just wanted to hear your voice, and I wanted to tell you that the field that I always said had a rock problem actually had something completely different going on." She said, "Dad, what does that mean?" He said, "It means things are going to be different. It means you can have a real bed at the house when you come back." He said, "It means I think we're going to be okay." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Were you always going to be okay, and you just didn't know it?" He looked at the hole in the ground at the door that had been sealed for over a century, at the boulder sitting 12 feet from where it had rested for as long as anyone in his family could remember. He said, "Yeah, Bug, I think that might be exactly right." Victor Chu drove back to Billings that evening, with the ledger locked in an archival case he had brought specifically for material of the kind of preparation that suggested he had spent enough years in this work to know that the most important things were always the ones nobody expected to find. He left Earl with a typed list of the 41 names printed in clean columns on white paper that looked almost absurdly ordinary against the weight of what it represented. Earl sat at the kitchen table with the list after Karen and Bobby had gone to sleep and read through the names again. He had done this already several times, but reading a list repeatedly was something he had always done when trying to absorb a thing that was bigger than one reading could hold. His grandfather had told him once that a man who only reads a thing once doesn't really believe it yet. Earl had thought that was a strange thing to say at the time. He understood it now. 41 names. 7 of them he recognized as surnames still present in the county. Families whose descendants farmed or ranched or ran businesses in towns Earl had driven through his entire life without knowing they carried any particular connection to his land. 16 others he recognized as names from the region's broader history, the kind that showed up on old maps and in the titles of local history books that sat unread in the back sections of county libraries. The remaining 18 were names he could not place at all, names that suggested origins in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and 2 that appeared to be indigenous, written in the ledger's anglicized transliteration that could have obscured the original form entirely. He made a second cup of coffee and looked at those last 2 names for a long time. Then he went to bed, because there was work the next morning, and his body did not care what had been found in his field. The wheat did not understand that history had been discovered beneath it. The legal situation clarified itself faster than Earl had expected, and not entirely in his favor. He had called an attorney the day after the discovery, a woman named Sandra Elliott, who practiced in Miles City and whose specialty was agricultural property disputes, which meant she had spent 2 decades watching farmers lose things they should not have lost. She came out to the property within 48 hours, walked through the underground room with Helen Marsh's preliminary inventory in hand, and sat at Earl's kitchen table with a coffee she didn't touch and a legal pad she filled on both sides. What she told him was this: his ownership of the land was unambiguous. The underground structure and everything in it was legally part of the property under Montana statute, which meant his claim to the material was sound. The ledger's language about the common holding and its terms of guardianship was morally interesting but legally complicated because it had never been registered as a formal trust, and trusts that existed only in handwritten documents from 1887 occupied uncertain territory when they encountered contemporary property law. She said, in practical terms, you could take everything in that room, and no court in this state would fault you for it. You own it. It's on your land. The legal framework is clear, he said. But she looked at him. She said, but nothing legally. I'm telling you the law. What you do with the law is your business. He said, what about the descendants of the contributors? She considered this. She said if they can establish lineage to names in the ledger, and if the ledger can be authenticated as a genuine record of contribution rather than a personal memoir, then they have a moral claim that a court might consider sympathetic, but would not be obligated to enforce. The material has been on Hadley land for over a century. Adverse possession principles alone would support your ownership. He said, I'm not asking about adverse possession. I'm asking what's right. She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something on the legal pad and slid it across the table. It said, then you need a different kind of lawyer. She wrote a name and number below it. A man named Joseph Elk Running, who practiced in Billings and specialized in cases that involved historical land claims and indigenous property rights. She said he was one of the best she had encountered in 30 years, and that he would have thoughts about 2 of the names in the ledger that she was not qualified to address. Earl called Joseph Elk Running that afternoon. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered territory that Earl had not anticipated entering when he moved to Boulder from his field. Elk Running's voice was precise and unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned to take the time a subject required, because rushing it cost more than patience did. He asked Earl to read him the 2 names from the ledger that had the appearance of anglicized indigenous names. He was quiet for a moment after Earl read them. He said those are Crow names, modified in transliteration, but unmistakably Crow. He said the period you're describing, 1887 to 1903, was a period of significant dispossession for Crow communities in eastern Montana. The DAW Act of 1887 broke up communal landholdings and created conditions under which individual allotments could be, and frequently were, lost through fraud, pressure, and manipulation by settlers and railroad interests. Earl listened. Elk Running said, if Crow individuals or families contributed material resources to a collective holding during this period, the historical context suggests they may have been doing so as a survival strategy under conditions of extreme duress. Their descendants' relationship to those contributions is not simply a matter of lineage. It carries a weight that the law as currently written does not fully account for. Earl asked what that meant in practical terms. Elk Running said, it meant that if Earl wanted to do this correctly, he would need to contact the Crow Nation directly and have a conversation before any other decisions were made. He said it not as a legal instruction, but as a statement about what correct meant in this context, the way a man speaks when he has spent his career watching what happened when correct was skipped. Earl said, can you help me do that? Elk Running said he could. The legal complexity arrived from another direction 3 days later, in the form of a letter from a law firm in Billings, whose letterhead Earl did not recognize. The letter was addressed to him as landowner of the Hadley property and informed him that a party whose identity was described as a client of the firm had become aware of the discovery on his land and was prepared to make an offer for the property in its entirety, including all contents, at a figure that the letter described as substantially above assessed value. The figure was $4 million. Earl sat with the letter and did the math. $4 million would pay off every debt he had. It would buy Karen and Lily a house in Billings if they wanted it, and a better truck and Lily's college, and probably enough left over to make the remaining years comfortable in a way that Earl had genuinely stopped imagining was possible. $4 million was more money than his family had touched across 5 generations combined. He put the letter in the kitchen drawer with Thomas Hadley's letters and called Sandra Elliott. She said the offer was real, the firm was legitimate, and the figure was low. She said substantially above assessed value for a depleted wheat farm in eastern Montana was not the same as substantially above the value of what had been discovered on that farm. She said the client, whoever they were, knew what was in the ground and was offering Earl $4 million to take away something that Helen Marsh's preliminary estimate suggested could be worth between $400 million and considerably more, depending on the SA office containers and the condition of the documents and the numismatic value of the coins. Earl said he understood. She said, "Do you? Because $4 million is a lot of money to a man in your position, and the people making this offer know that." He said, "Yes, that's why they made it." He put the phone down and walked out to the field. The hole was covered now with a steel plate Gus had welded from equipment scraps, padlocked and set into the ground. Not beautiful, but effective. The boulder sat beside it, permanent, immovable in its new position. He stood between them in the late morning cold and thought about the kind of person who moved fast when someone else found something. The kind of person who calculated another man's desperation and set a price on it. He thought about Thomas Hadley, who had put a boulder on top of something to slow that kind of person down. He went back inside and wrote a single-sentence response to the law firm's letter. He said the property was not for sale. He asked Sandra Elliott to file it. The offer was not the last one. A second letter arrived 8 days later from a different firm, this one offering $6 million. Then a third offering $9 million. Each one arrived with the same basic structure, a price that seemed large until you understood what was being purchased, and a timeline that communicated urgency in language designed to sound like helpfulness. Earl filed each response through Elliott. The property is not for sale. Word had spread as words spread in rural Montana, which was to say quickly and with an accuracy that varied depending on who was telling it. The Hendersons' boy, Tyler, had posted something on social media the day of the discovery. Nothing specific, but enough to spark interest among people who tracked rural property news and agricultural anomalies. A blogger who specialized in treasure hunting had picked it up within a week and written a piece that was long on speculation and short on fact, but accurate enough in its core claim to bring journalists. The first reporter showed up at Earl's gate on a Tuesday morning, a young woman from the Billings Gazette named Rachel Torres, who had driven 3 hours without an appointment and knocked on the gate post with the confident patience of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that waiting at gates was half the job. Earl walked down from the house and stood on his side of the gate, and they looked at each other through the wire. She said, "Mr. Hadley, I'm not going to pretend I don't know what was found on your property. I'd like to tell the story accurately rather than have someone else tell it wrong." He said, "What do you know?" She said she knew there was a substantial underground structure. She knew it contained materials of historical and monetary significance. She knew he had retained an attorney and an assayer and a historical archivist, and she knew that 3 separate law firms had made offers for the property that he had declined. He said, "How do you know about the offers?" She said that in her experience, law firms that moved quickly on matters like this were not always careful about who they talked to. He stood at the gate for a moment. Then he said, "Come back in 2 weeks. When I know more of the story myself, I'll tell it to you properly." She said she would hold the story for 2 weeks if he would give her the first interview. He said, "Deal." She drove away, and Earl watched the dust settle behind her car and thought that 2 weeks was not a lot of time and that he had better use it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The formal essay process began the following Monday. when Helen Marsh returned with a colleague, a man named Dennis Park, who had done authentication work for auction houses in New York and now consulted from a ranch outside Bozeman. They worked in the underground room for 3 full days, which required temporary lighting, a portable ventilation system, and the patience of people who understood that speed was not the appropriate response to material this old. Earl went down each morning to observe and came back up each evening with more understanding than he had gone in with. The raw gold in the canvas bags was alluvial material consistent with placer gold from the creek drainages in the region. Dennis Park explained that, during the Homestead period, small-scale placer mining had been common practice for settlers in areas with accessible creek gold. Not enough to make anyone wealthy individually, but enough accumulated over years and contributed collectively by dozens of families to build a reserve that represented genuine financial strength. The coins were a mixture of Liberty Head double eagles, Morgan silver dollars, and several series of seeded Liberty coins, some dating to the 1840s, which meant they had been old already when they were deposited. Their condition varied, but several of the Morgan dollars and the earlier seeded Liberty pieces were in states of preservation that made Dennis Park handle them with a care that bordered on reverence. He said that a complete set of seeded Liberty quarters in the condition he was seeing would alone command prices that made the face value irrelevant. The 4 iron office containers took the longest, both because the locks had to be cut with equipment brought in specifically for the purpose, without damaging the containers themselves, which had their own value, and because what was inside required careful documentation before anything was moved. Each container held gold bars as Puitt had predicted, 16 bars total, each stamped with the SA office mark and weight and finest designation. The stamps were clear. The bars were in the condition of things that had never been touched by air or light since they were sealed. Dennis Park sat beside the opened containers for a long time without writing anything. Then he said that he needed to make some calls before he could give Earl a complete figure, because the historical significance of federal SA bars in original sealed containers from this period was a market category that did not have frequent comparable sales and therefore required consultation with specialists in that narrow area. Earl asked him for a rough estimate pending that consultation. Park said rough estimate. Speaking only about these for containers and their contents, he said a number. Earl sat down on the floor of the underground room. Park said, "That's before the collector premium for the containers themselves, which are exceptionally rare in this condition." Earl said, "How exceptionally rare?" Park said, "I am aware of 3 other examples in institutional collections." He paused. "None of them are intact with sealed contents. None." Earl looked at the bars, heavy and dull, and absolutely real in the portable light they had strung across the ceiling. Gold that had been refined and stamped and sealed into these containers sometime in the 1880s or 1890s, and had not been opened since. Sitting under a boulder in a Montana wheat field through 2 world wars and a depression and a century of seasons, while the families who had trusted it there scattered and their descendants grew up without knowing it existed, he said, "What do you think the whole room is worth?" Park looked at his colleague. Helen Marsh looked back at him. They had the expression of 2 people who had agreed on a number between themselves and were now deciding how to say it to a man sitting on the floor of a sealed underground room in eastern Montana. Park said complete valuation, pending full documentation and authentication. He paused, between $800 million and $1.2 billion. He said the range was wide because the documents and the numismatic coins required specialist appraisal he could not provide, and because market conditions for certain categories of historical material could move substantially. He said the floor of $800 million was conservative, meaning it assumed average outcomes in every category. He said the ceiling is probably higher than 1.2. We're being careful. Earl nodded slowly, as a man nods when he has been told something that has no proportion he can hold in his hands, and so he nods to keep himself present in the room, while his thinking reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. He said, "Okay." Park said Earl number. He almost laughed. He said she's upstairs. Park said go get her. He went up the stairs and into the field, and then into the house where Karen was at the kitchen table helping Lily with homework over video call. The tablet propped against the sugar bowl that had come with the house when Earl's parents bought it and was still there 30 years later, because nobody had ever thought to replace it. Karen looked up when he came in. She read his face. She said to Lily, "Honey, I'm gonna call you back in a little while." Lily said, "Is everything okay?" Karen said, "Everything is very okay." She clicked off the tablet and looked at Earl. she said. "Tell me," he told her. She sat with it for a moment. A long moment. The kind that had texture to it, where you could feel the person across from you, processing something that required the rearranging of the whole structure of their expectations. Then she said, "That's more than 9 offers." He said, "Considerably," she said. "And you turned down 9 million," he said. "The last offer was 9. Yes." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Good." She said it simply, without additional weight. The way someone says a thing when they have always trusted the person who made the decision and have just been given new reason to. He sat down across from her and they were both quiet for a while in the kitchen, with the handleless mug and the sugar bowl, and the window that looked out over the field where the steel plate covered the door and the ground. Karen said, "The family's the 41. He said, "Yes." She said, "We're still doing that." He said, "That's the first thing we're doing." She reached across the table and took his hand. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The search for descendants began in a way that felt inadequate to its purpose, which was Earl at his kitchen table, with Victor Chu on the phone, and a laptop open to genealogical databases that Victor walked him through accessing. Victor had spent the 2 weeks since the discovery in archival research himself, following the names in the ledger through historical records, census documents, land transaction files, and the kind of obscure county courthouse documentation that only people who knew what they were looking for could find. He had located potential descendant lines for 23 of the 41 names. The remaining 18 were harder, either because the families had left the region entirely with no traceable destination, or because the records from that period for certain communities were incomplete in the systematic way that records for marginalized communities tended to be incomplete, which was to say deliberately, as a consequence of institutions that had not considered their documentation worth maintaining. The 7 names whose descendants were still present in the county were the easiest. Earl knew 2 of those families personally, or knew of them the way you knew people in a county of this size. Names and faces attached to vehicles and properties, and the general outline of their lives. He drove to see both families himself, without calling ahead, because he had learned in 11 years of difficult farming that some conversations went better when the other person didn't have time to build a defense against them. The first was the Kowalski family, whose great-great-grandfather, Jan Kowalski, appeared in the ledger, with a contribution of 4 gold coins and 2 land deed certificates, from parcels that no longer appeared under that name on any county map. The family now ran a cattle operation on the north side of the county, smaller than it had been historically. According to Victor's research, the land having been reduced generation by generation through a combination of sales and losses that traced a line of gradual diminishment that Earl recognized. He sat in their kitchen with the current patriarch, a man named Dale Kowalski, who was a few years older than Earl and had the same kind of weather-worn quality that came from spending your working life outdoors in Montana. Earl put the printed copy of the ledger page on the table between them. Dale's great-great-grandfather's name visible at the top of one column. Dale looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "My grandmother used to say that Jan lost something that should have come back. She said it like it was a family story that didn't have an ending yet." He said, "I always thought she meant land." Earl said he contributed resources to a collective holding that has been intact on my property since 1887. He explained the ledger, the underground room, the terms of the guardianship document. He said, "I don't know yet exactly what the legal structure looks like for returning what was contributed. I have lawyers working on that. But I wanted you to know before anyone else told you, and I wanted to tell you myself." Dale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ledger entry. He said, "Jan trusted your family with something." Earl said, "He did." Dale said, "And you're here?" Earl said, "I'm here." They sat together in the Kowalski kitchen for another hour, talking about their respective operations, and the land, and the way things had changed in the county across the decades, since 2 men, whose names were now in a ledger, had agreed to trust each other with something that mattered. It was not a comfortable conversation or an easy one. It was the kind of conversation that 2 people have when they are both holding the weight of history and neither of them quite knows how to put it down. But it was real, and it was honest. And when Earl left, Dale walked him to his truck and said, "My grandmother would have wanted to know this." Earl said, "That's why I came." The second family conversation was harder. The Renfruit family, whose ancestor, Silas Renfruit, appeared in the ledger with a contribution described simply as gold and title, had a complicated feeling about the Hadley name that Earl had not known about and was not prepared for. He learned about it sitting across from an elderly woman named Dorothea Renfro, who was 81 years old and had lived on the remaining 40 acres of what had once been a 300-acre homestead her entire life. She looked at the ledger copy and looked at Earl and said very directly that her family had a different version of the story. She said that Silas Renfrew had not contributed willingly to the common holding. She said the family history told it that Silas had been pressured into contributing, that a man named Hadley had told him the holding was his best protection against the railroad agents, who were already moving through the county, buying up claims at pistol point prices, but that Silas had never fully trusted it, and when the holding was never accessed, and the resources never returned. The Renfrew family had drawn a different conclusion than trust from that silence. Earl sat with this for a moment. He said, "The ledger records a contribution from your ancestor. It also records the terms that the material would be held and returned when needed, or when the guardianship ended." Dorothea said, "The guardianship never ended to us. It just disappeared." He said, "It didn't disappear. It was sealed in the ground on my property for 120 years. Nobody knew." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had spent 81 years carrying a story about someone else's failure and was now being asked to revise it based on new information, which is not a simple ask, regardless of how true the information is. She said, "Your great-great-grandfather sealed it in the ground." He said yes, with a boulder on top to protect it from the railroad interests. She was quiet for a long time. Outside her window, her 40 acres of grass showed the history of what had once been larger, in the way that contracted things always did, more carefully tended than land that had room to spare. She said, "Silas always said that man was either the most trustworthy person he'd ever met or the most devious. Said he could never decide which." Earl said, "I think the answer might be neither of those." "Exactly. I think he was just a man trying to do something right, in a time when doing right was complicated." Dorothea looked at the ledger again. Then she looked at Earl. She said, "What are you proposing to do?" He said, "I'm trying to find every family, talk to everyone personally, figure out what a fair accounting looks like, and then build a legal structure that honors it." He said, "I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I know it doesn't look like me keeping everything and calling it legal just because the law says I can." Dorothea was quiet again. Then she said, "My grandmother told me that story about Silas every Christmas. Every Christmas for 80 years, this family told that story." She said, "It would mean something to be able to tell a different ending." He said, "That's what I'm trying to do." He drove home that evening on roads he had driven his entire life and thought about the particular weight of carrying something for 120 years without knowing it, and whether that was better or worse than carrying it knowingly. He thought about Dorothea Renfro's grandmother telling the story of Silas every Christmas for 80 years, the repetition of a wound that had no resolution. He thought about what it cost a family to hold that kind of story across generations, and what it cost them not to. He thought about his own family's version, which had been no story at all, just a boulder and a letter too vague to decode without the context the letter did not include. Both were forms of loss, he decided. The Renfrews had lost the resource and kept the story. The Hadleys had kept the resource and lost the story. Neither family had come through the century hole. Joseph Elk Running called him the following Thursday to say that he had made contact with representatives of the Cone Nation regarding the two names in the ledger, and that a meeting had been arranged for the following week in Billings. He said the conversation would require Earl's full presence and attention, and that he should come prepared to listen more than he spoke. Earl said he understood. Elk Running said, "I want to be clear about something before you go into that meeting." He said, "The Crow individuals whose names appear in your ledger were living under conditions in 1887 that most contemporary people cannot fully comprehend. The Dawes Act had been signed that same year. The reservation had been reduced multiple times. The buffalo were gone. Traditional subsistence had been destroyed by federal policy within a single decade." He said, "When Crow people contributed resources to your great-great-grandfather's collective holding, they were doing so from a position of extreme vulnerability and under a policy environment specifically designed to dispossess them. Whatever they gave was not given freely in the way we typically understand free choice. It was given under duress that the law created." Earl said, "What does that mean for what I owe them?" Elk Running said, "I'll let them answer that." The meeting in Billings took place in a conference room, in a building that looked like it had been designed to be used for exactly this kind of difficult, necessary conversation. Functional, without being comfortable. Private, without being oppressive. Earl arrived early and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in. Not because he was uncertain about the meeting, but because he wanted to be clear in his own thinking before it began. 3 people were present from the Crow Nation. An elder named Raymond Many Bears, who had white hair, and the kind of stillness that came from long practice with patience. A woman in her 40s named Christine Stands Alone, who was a tribal attorney and carried herself with a precision that made Earl immediately understand. She had heard every version of this kind of story, and was here to make sure this one was different. And a younger man named Thomas Littlehawk, who was a cultural preservation officer, and said almost nothing during the meeting, but took notes with the focused attention of someone building a record. Elk Running made brief introductions, and then Earl explained the ledger, the underground room, the contents, and his decision to find all 41 families before making any decisions about the material. He put the ledger pages on the table, the relevant entries visible, the names readable. Raymond. Many Bears looked at the names for a long time. He did not speak immediately. In the silence, Earl waited, because Elk Running had told him to. Finally, Many Bears said in a voice that was unhurried, and carried the specific quality of a man speaking in a language that was not the one he thought, in that the names were known to him. He said that the family lines were traceable through oral history even where written records were absent, because oral history had been the way his people had maintained knowledge across time, before written records were imposed as the only valid form. He said that the contributions described in the ledger were consistent with what the family histories described as a period of desperate alliance-making between Crow families and certain settlers who had distinguished themselves by treating Crow people as people rather than obstacles. He said Thomas Hadley's name was known in some of those family histories. He said the general characterization was of a man who kept his word, which had been notable enough to be remembered. Earl sat with that for a moment. Christine Stands Alone said our interest is not primarily financial. She said it clearly, the way a person says something that they need to be heard exactly. She said our interest is in the historical record, in the acknowledgement that Crow families were part of this community, this collective effort, at a time when federal policy was systematically erasing our presence from this land. She said whatever financial accounting is appropriate, we can discuss that, but the first thing we need is acknowledgement that this happened, that it is documented, and that the documentation is preserved. Earl said Victor Chu, my archivist is working to make sure the full documentary record is preserved properly and made accessible. He said I would like your involvement in determining how that record is framed and presented. Christine looked at him carefully. She said that's not a common offer. He said it's the right one. Raymond Many Bear spoke again. He said that he would like to visit the property. He said he would like to see the room and the ledger in its original location, and stand on the ground where his ancestors' names were recorded. He said this not as a demand, but as a request made with the dignity of someone who understood the difference. Earl said, you're welcome on my land whenever you choose to come. Many Bears nodded. He said, Thomas Hadley told a crowman named Standing Horse that the stone would keep what was given safe until the people who gave it needed it back, or until the need had passed. He said Standing Horse told his children that Hadley meant it, that he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. Earl thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer, the men from the settlement, the old way, the right knowing. He said he meant it. Many Bears looked at him for a moment. He said, yes, we think he did. The drive back from Billings was 3 hours, on roads that crossed some of the flattest and most exposed country in Montana. The kind of landscape that gave a man too much sky and not enough to interrupt his thinking. Earl drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and spent the 3 hours understanding things he had not understood that morning. He understood that what Thomas Hadley had built was not just a financial reserve. It was an act of cross-cultural trust in a period when the political and legal structures of the country were actively working to make that kind of trust impossible. It had required Hadley to treat people as equal participants in something important, when the law around him classified some of those people as legally lesser. It had required Standing Horse, and whoever the second Crow contributor had been, to trust a settler at a time when settlers had given them every reason not to extend that trust. It had worked, not perfectly, not without loss and grief, and the kind of silences that generated Dorotha Renfrew's Christmas story, but the thing itself had held. The material had been preserved, the ledger had survived, the The door in the ground had stayed closed, and the boulder had stayed on top of it, through everything that a century and a quarter could put a thing through. He thought about what it meant that it was still there. He thought about Rachel Torres, the journalist from the Gazette, whose 2-week window was now almost up. He called her from the road and said he was ready to talk. She arrived at the property 2 days later with a photographer and a recorder in the manner of someone who understood she was about to be trusted with something and intended to honor that trust. Earl walked her around the field first, showing her the boulder in its new position, and the steel plate over the entrance, and the way the field looked ordinary, except for those two things, which together told the whole story of before and after. Then he took her down the stairs. She stood in the underground room with the portable lights going and said nothing for a long time. The shelving with the canvas bags, the open crates with their coins and protective trays, now carefully organized by Helen Marsh's cataloging process. The 4 iron essay containers, their lids removed and interiors documented, sitting in a row along the far wall. The document boxes with Victor Chu's careful labeling, the empty space where the ledger had been, now in archival storage. But Victor had provided a facsimile that lay in its approximate original location. She said, "How did you know to look?" He said, "I didn't. I just couldn't afford to keep not looking." She recorded the full conversation, 2 hours in the room and another hour at the kitchen table. He told her about Thomas Hadley's letter, about the 41 names, about Dale Kowalski and Dorothea Renfrew in the meeting with Raymond Minibears and Christine Stands Alone. He told her about the 3 law firms that had offered to buy the property, and about turning down $9 million at a time when he was behind on the banknote and had a lien on his combine. She said, "Why did you turn it down?" He said, "Because $4 million was what they thought I was worth, and $9 million was what they thought I could be pressured to accept. Neither number had anything to do with what was actually in the ground." She said, "And what's in the ground?" He said, 120 years of people trusting each other when trusting was hard." He paused. "The money is what makes the news, but the money isn't the thing." She looked at him. She said, "What's the thing?" He said, "The thing is that my great-great-grandfather made a promise to 41 families and the promise held." He said, "I'd like to make sure it continues to hold." The story ran 3 days later on a Tuesday morning, the kind of article that newspapers didn't run often enough because it required a reporter patient enough to find all the pieces, and a subject willing to talk honestly about a thing that most people in his position would have handled entirely differently. It was long. It named names, not the specific financial figures which Earl had asked Torres to hold until the legal structure was in place, but the names of the families, the history of the collective holding, the meeting with the Crow Nation representatives, the turndown offers. It ran on the front page below the fold, and by noon, it had been picked up by the wire and was running in papers across the state and then the region, and then by the following morning, in places that had no particular interest in Montana agriculture, but a deep interest in a story about a man who found $1 billion in his field and called his neighbors before he called his bank. The calls that came after were of 2 kinds, and they arrived in roughly equal numbers, which told Earl something about the distribution of human nature. The first kind were people who wanted to help, genealogists who had tools and databases and a willingness to work for free on cases that mattered to them, historians who had relevant research they had never found a use for, a woman in Chicago who had spent 20 years researching her family's Montana homestead history and had found references to the collective holding in letters that had not made sense until she read the article, a Crow Nation historian in Lodge Grass who had oral records of Standing Horse and his family and wanted to talk to Earl and Raymond Minibears together about preserving those records alongside the documentary evidence from the ledger. The second kind were lawyers, different lawyers from different firms with different variations of the same essential offer, which was that they could help Earl structure this in a way that maximized his personal return on assets that were legally his and that he had no legal obligation to share with anyone. Some of them were very good at explaining this. Some of them were very persuasive. One of them drove out to the property uninvited and spent 45 minutes at the kitchen table laying out a structure that would have given Earl full control of the material while making a series of charitable donations to organizations with impressive names that had no particular connection to any of the 41 families. Earl listened to the full 45 minutes because he believed in listening. Then he said, "I appreciate the time." He said, "That's not what we're doing. The lawyer said he understood Earl's instinct, but said that instinct was not a legal strategy. Earl said, "No, it's a moral one. I have lawyers working on the legal strategy." The lawyer said respectfully that moral instincts were expensive in contexts involving assets of this magnitude. Earl said, "I know." He stood up, which ended the meeting. The legal architecture that Sandra Elliott and Joseph Elkrun began building together over the following weeks was unlike anything either of them had worked on before, which they acknowledged freely, and which seemed to focus rather than discourage them. It drew on trust law, on historical claims precedent, on provisions in Montana property statute that had rarely been applied to circumstances anything like this, and on a structure of negotiated agreement that required each of the descendant families to be contacted, verified, and brought into a process of collective decision-making about the material and its distribution. It was slow. It was complicated. It generated paperwork in quantities that required a filing system Earl had not known how to build until Victor Chu built it for him. And it worked. Not all at once, not without difficulty, but steadily. The way things work when the people doing them are committed to getting them right, rather than getting them done. The Chicago woman's name was Margaret Novak, and she arrived in Montana on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, driving a car whose back seat was entirely occupied by archival boxes and a large thermos of coffee. She was 62 years old and had worked as a librarian for 30 years, and had spent the 2 decades since her retirement doing the thing she had always actually wanted to do, which was find things that were lost. She had the precise energy of someone whose hobby had become serious without becoming solemn. And she walked through Earl's field to the Boulder with her hands in her jacket pockets, and said without preamble that she believed her family had contributed to the collective holding under a name that appeared in the ledger as Noeg, anglicized from Noeg, her great-great-grandmother's maiden name. Victor Chu had already identified this connection through document research and had included Margaret Novak on the list of confirmed descendant contacts, but she had come anyway in person because she said that some things deserved a person rather than a letter. Earl walked her down the stairs. She stood in the underground room in silence for a full minute. Then she said in a voice that was controlled but not quite steady, "My grandmother's grandmother's name is in that ledger." She said it the way people say things that they have been working toward for a long time and have finally arrived at. He said, "Yes, it is." She said she came here from Poland in 1882. She came alone. She was 19 years old. He said, Victor found the immigration record. She put her hand against the shelving where the canvas bags had been now empty, their contents documented and secured. She said she always told her children that she had put everything she had into the ground here, that it was safe, that someday it would come back. Earl said she was right. Margaret Novak looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been looking for this for 20 years, and I didn't know what I was looking for." She said, "I thought it was land records. I thought it was just history." He said, "It is history." She said, "It's more than that." He said, "Yeah, I know." They stood in the underground room where the portable lights hummed and the dressed stone walls held the cold of a century and more. And the door at the top of the stairs let in a rectangle of Montana sky that had been sealed away since before either of their families had understood what they were part of. Margaret Novak said, "Your great-great-grandfather kept a promise to my great-great-grandmother across 120 years." Earl said he tried to. She said he succeeded. Earl thought about the Boulder, about the letter, about Thomas Hadley writing to his brother in language vague enough to survive the wrong reader, and specific enough to survive for the right one, about a man who had built something to endure, and then trusted the endurance to mean something to someone who came after, even if he never lived to see whether it did. He said, "I think he would have wanted to know you came." Margaret Novak looked around the room one more time. Then she nodded once and climbed the stairs back into the light. Earl followed her up outside. The field ran out to the ridge in the east, pale in the early spring, the soil dark and turned from where Gus had backfilled around the steel plate. The boulder sat in its new position, lichen continuing to grow across its surface, as though nothing had changed, which in the ways that mattered to lichen, nothing had. The sky was high and clear, and the particular blue that appeared over eastern Montana in the weeks before full spring, when the air still had cold in it, but the angle of the sun had shifted enough to mean something. Karen stood at the field's edge with 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, and one for whoever came up from the underground room wanting one. She handed one to Margaret Novak without a word, the way you offered something to a person who had just been somewhere difficult and needed a moment before they were ready to talk about it. Lily was inside doing homework at the kitchen table. She had come back from Billings 3 weeks ago with her school things, and her winter coat, and the stuffed animal she had carried since she was 4, and the easy confidence of a child who had been told clearly that home was a real place now, and meant it. She had walked through the field on her first day back, and stood beside the boulder and said, "Dad, it's really big." And he had said, "Yeah." And she had said, "What does it feel like to find something like that?" And he had said, "Honestly, it feels like I should have moved it sooner." She had laughed the way kids laughed when adults admitted things that were obvious. And then she had run back to the house to see her room. Her room had a bed in it now. A real one, bought the week after the preliminary appraisal. Nothing extravagant, just a bed with a frame and a headboard, and the kind of mattress that did not require apologizing for. It had taken Earl longer to buy the bed than it probably should have, because buying something for his daughter that should have always been there felt like it required acknowledging every year it had not been, and that acknowledgement was heavier than the price of the bed. But he bought it, and Lily had slept in it the first night back, and said the next morning that she had slept really well, which she said the way 9-year-olds said things that they meant completely, and had no idea were breaking their father's heart in a good way. Earl stood in his field with the empty coffee cup and looked at the hole in the ground, and the boulder, and the ridge to the east, where spring was starting to mean something. He thought about what came next. What came next was complicated, and would take longer than he had originally expected, which had itself been a long time. The legal structure was building, the family contacts were ongoing. The authentication process was thorough and slow, and full of moments where a specialist would pause over some item in the underground room and say something in a low voice that suggested they were in the presence of something they had not expected and were recalibrating. The Crow Nation historian and Raymond Minibears and Victor Chu were working together on a documentary project that was growing into something more than Earl had originally imagined when he suggested that the records should be preserved and accessible, and the land was still there. The 340 acres of depleted topsoil that had been failing were still there, and they required attention regardless of what was in the ground beneath them. Earl had contracted with an agricultural consultant to begin a soil restoration program, not because he needed the wheat income anymore, not even close, but because the land had been in his family for 5 generations, and 5 generations of effort deserved to be honored by the 6th, rather than abandoned because the 6th had other resources now. He would fix the soil. He would plant it right. He would keep the equipment maintained with a new combine that had no lien on it, and he would farm the land the way it should have been farmed if drought and debt had not reduced his options down to survival calculations. Not because he had to, because Thomas Hadley had stood on this ground and made decisions that required being worthy of it, and Earl felt the weight of that example more clearly than he had ever felt anything. He walked back toward the house. Karen was still standing at the field's edge with Margaret Novak, and the 2 women were talking in the way women talked when they had discovered they had something real in common, and were working out what that meant, quickly and directly, and without the circling approach men often used. He caught a fragment as he passed. Margaret was saying something about her grandmother's immigration story, about a woman who had crossed an ocean with nothing, and then put that nothing into the ground in Montana, on the word of a stranger, and how that had always seemed to her the bravest thing she had ever heard of. Karen said, "It takes a certain kind of faith in people." Margaret said, "It takes a certain kind of people to be worth that faith." Earl walked past them into the house, and up to the kitchen, where Lily was at the table with her math homework. She looked up when he came in. He said, "How's math?" She said, "Hard." He said, "Yeah." He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the field. Lily said, "Dad," he said. "Yeah," she said. "Do you think great-great-great-grandfather Thomas knew someone would find it someday?" He stood at the window. The boulder was visible from here as it had always been, the same shape it had always been, just in a different position now, no longer covering anything. He said, "I think he hoped someone would. I think he wrote that letter because he wanted someone to be able to find it if they needed to." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He didn't know it would be you." Earl said, "No, he didn't know it would be me." She said, "But it was." He said, "Yeah, it was." She went back to her math. He stood at the window a moment longer, looking at the field that had given him nothing for 11 years, and then given him everything, and thought about the particular shape of a life that required you to keep going through the nothing in order to arrive at the everything. He thought about what he owed to the nothing years, because without them, he would not have been standing at the window with the field in front of him, understanding what it meant. He thought about 41 names in a ledger written by a man who had understood that some things kept better in the hands of many than in the hands of one. He put the glass in the sink and went back outside, because there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And for the first time in 11 years, that felt like a privilege rather than a sentence. Spring came to eastern Montana the way it always did, reluctantly and fits announcing itself for a week and then retreating back into cold before finally committing. The sky over Earl's land went through a dozen different personalities in April alone. Clear and hard one morning, low and gray the next, full of fast-moving clouds the morning after that. Each one different enough that you never quite stopped noticing the sky the way you stopped noticing things that stayed the same. Earl noticed the sky that spring more than he had in years. He noticed a lot of things more than he had in years. The authentication process was completed in the second week of May, a full 7 months after the Boulder had been moved. Helen Marsh and Dennis Park delivered their final report in a document that ran to 61 pages and contained figures that had not changed substantially from the preliminary estimates, except in one category, the numismatic value of the coins, which had come in higher than projected because several of the Morgan dollars were in a state of preservation that specialists in that particular area said was essentially unprecedented for coins of that vintage in non-institutional storage. The word unprecedented appeared 3 times in the final report. Earl had never seen it in a document before, and now it appeared 3 times in one about his field. The total authenticated value inclusive of the raw gold, the refined bars, the coin collection, the assay containers as artifacts distinct from their contents, and a conservative estimate for the documents pending academic publication, sat at $1.14 billion. Sandra Elliott read that number to Earl over the phone on a Tuesday morning while he was replacing a fence post in the north pasture, which was the kind of thing that still needed doing regardless of what numbers existed in documents. He was holding the post with one hand and his phone with the other, and the number did not make him drop either of them, which he thought afterwards said something about the 7 months between the discovery and the confirmation. That time had prepared him for the reality in the way that living with something every day prepared you for its weight even before you were formally told how heavy it was. He said, "Okay." Elliott said, "Earl, I've been a lawyer for 30 years." He said, "Yeah." She said, "I have never said a number that large to a client while they were fixing a fence." He said, "The fence still needed fixing." She laughed. It was a real one, surprised out of her, and he could hear the release in it. She said, "The legal structure is ready for the distribution process. When you are. Joseph and I have built something that we think honors the ledger's terms while satisfying current statute. It requires the formal agreement of each participating family, which means another round of conversations, but the framework is solid." He said, "How long will the full process take?" She said, "Done carefully. 12 to 18 months from first family agreement to final distribution." He said, "Let's start." The framework that Elliott and Elkrunning had built was, in Elkrunning's words, probably the most creative piece of property law drafted in Montana in the last 50 years, which he said without particular pride, more as a statement of fact about the territory they had been working in. It established a formal trust, the Hadley Common Trust, which drew its name and its governing philosophy directly from the language of the 1887 agreement document Victor Chu had found in the underground room. The trust held the authenticated material while distribution was determined, and its board of directors included Earl, one representative from the Crow Nation selected by the nation itself, Margaret Novak as representative of the Eastern European immigrant descendant families, Dale Kowalski as representative of the county families, and a 5th seat held by a rotating representative from the remaining descendant groups as they were confirmed. The trust structure did 2 things simultaneously. It gave the descendant families legal standing in the distribution process, which addressed the gap that Elliott had identified between the moral claim and the legal one, and it protected Earl's foundational ownership of the land and the base structure of the discovery, which addressed the concern that well-meaning frameworks sometimes inadvertently created mechanisms that could be weaponized by bad actors later. It was not perfect, Elliott said so directly and frequently, but it was real, and it was built to serve the people it was meant to serve, which was more than most frameworks that dealt with money of this scale managed to do. The family confirmation process was the part that took the longest, and the part that mattered the most, which were often the same thing when something was done correctly. Victor Chu had by this point identified confirmed descendant lines for 37 of the 41 original contributors. The remaining 4 were names whose trails had gone cold across the century and a quarter since the ledger's final entry. Families who had either left no traceable descendants or whose records had been lost in the systematic way that certain communities' records were lost. For those 4, the trust established a memorial allocation, funds held in a designated account, and used for historical preservation and educational work related to the settlement period and the collective holding, which was Elkrun's suggestion, and which Earl thought was exactly right, because the absence of a traceable descendant did not erase the fact of the original contribution or diminish its claim to acknowledgement. The 37 confirmed families were contacted in writing first, and then in person, wherever it was possible, which was most cases. Earl did the in-person conversations himself when the family was within driving distance, which covered 22 of them. For the others, he traveled, which was something he had not done in years, and which turned out to be one of the things the discovery gave him that no financial figure could have covered separately. He drove to Missoula and sat across from a retired schoolteacher named George Petrov, whose great-great-grandfather had contributed to the holding, and who had grown up with a family story that described the loss of Montana land as a cautionary tale about trusting outsiders. He drove to Spokane and met with a woman named Helen Szymanski, who was 93 years old and had been told by her parents that her family had once had something in Montana that never came back, and who sat across from Earl in the common room of her assisted living facility and held the copy of the ledger page with her ancestor's name on it, with hands that shook from age and something that was not quite age. She said, "I'm going to die soon." She said it without drama, as a practical observation. She said, "I would like to know that this happened before I do." He said, "It happened. I'm here to tell you it happened." She looked at the ledger copy for a long time. Then she looked at him. She said, "Your great-great-grandfather was a good man." He said, "I'm starting to understand that." She said, "So are you." He drove back from Spokane in a single day, 11 hours on the road, and arrived home after dark to find Karen awake at the kitchen table with tea and the kind of expression that meant she had been waiting up, not from worry, but from wanting to see him when he came in. He sat down across from her and told her about Helen Szymanski. He told her about the ledger page in the 93-year-old hands and the things she had said at the end. Karen listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas Hadley couldn't have imagined you driving to Spokane." He said, "No." She said, "He just built something solid and hoped the right person would find it." He said, "Yeah." She said, "You're the right person, Earl." He sat with that. It was the kind of thing that was hard to receive directly because it implied a standard, and standards once named had to be lived up to. But Karen said it with the plainness of someone stating a fact she had observed and verified and was now simply reporting. And that quality of it made it land differently than if she had said it with sentiment. He said, "I'm trying to be." She said, "I know, that's what I mean." The first formal meeting of the Hadley Common Trust Board took place in June in the county courthouse meeting room because Earl had decided early that he did not want the trust to operate out of his kitchen or his field, that it needed a space that belonged to the process rather than to him personally. The courthouse room was not beautiful. It had the standard institutional combination of fluorescent lights and furniture purchased for durability rather than comfort. But it was official, and official mattered in ways that kitchens did not, particularly when the matter at hand required the kind of documented record that could survive future challenges. Raymond Minnie Bears arrived with Christine Stands Alone and Thomas Littlehawk, and 2 elders Earl had not previously met. A woman named Agnes Yellowtail, who was 90 years old and had agreed to travel for this meeting specifically because she had things to say that needed to be said in person and in the presence of all parties. And a younger man named Charlie Bearcloud, who served as translator when Agnes Yellowtail chose to speak in Crow, which she did for a portion of what she said. Agnes Yellowtail spoke for 15 minutes without stopping, and Charlie Bearcloud translated in real time. And what she said covered territory that Earl had not anticipated, and that made the room very quiet in the way rooms went quiet when something was being said that had been waiting a very long time. She spoke about Standing Horse, who was her mother's grandfather, and about what Standing Horse had told his children about the holding, and about Thomas Hadley. She said that Standing Horse had described the agreement as one of the few times in his adult life that a settler had approached him as an equal, had asked what he thought and waited for the answer, had considered the answer, and modified his plan accordingly. She said Standing Horse had told his children that this was what trust looked like when it was genuine, that it felt different in the body from trust that was performed, that you could tell the difference, and that day he had been sure. She said that Standing Horse had not expected to get anything back. She said he had contributed because the principle of the thing mattered to him, because people protecting each other across the lines that power drew between them was a practice his people had always understood, and that the world was trying to make impossible. And because sometimes the right thing to do in an impossible situation was to do it anyway and let the doing stand as testimony. She said in Crow something that Charlie Bear Cloud translated as a promise, remembered across 4 generations, is worth more than what was promised. The room was very quiet after that. Margaret Novak, who was sitting 2 seats from Agnes Yellowtail, pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment, and then straightened and looked at the table. Dale Kowalski had both hands flat on the table surface and was looking at them. Earl sat at the head of the table and felt the weight of what Agnes Yellowtail had said settle across the room like weather. He said, "Thank you." He said it to Agnes Yellowtail directly, and she looked at him with eyes that had seen 90 years of things, and said something in Crow that Charlie Bear Cloud translated as, "You have your great-great-grandfather's face around the eyes." Earl did not know what to do with that, so he said, "I hope I have some of the rest of him too." Charlie Bear Cloud translated this, and Agnes Yellowtail made a sound that might have been a laugh. It might have been something else. It was brief and warm and human, and it was the moment in that meeting that Earl would remember longest. The distribution framework required that each confirmed descendant family receive a proportional share based on the ledger's recorded contributions, adjusted by a formula that Elliott and Elkrunning had developed, with input from all 5 board members, and that no one was entirely satisfied with, and everyone agreed was the most fair option available. It was not possible to give each family exactly what their ancestor had contributed, because a century and a quarter of compounding and the authenticated value of the collection as a whole made precise original contribution accounting mathematically impossible. What was possible was a proportional framework that honored the relative weight of each contribution as recorded in the ledger and applied that proportion to the whole. For the smallest contributors, this meant amounts that changed their situations without transforming them beyond recognition. For the larger contributors, the amounts were substantial enough to require their own financial management plans, which Elliott insisted on building into the framework so that no family received a distribution without also receiving access to guidance about what to do with it. For the Crow Nation, the distribution was structured differently at Christine Stanzalone's insistence, and with the full support of every other board member, rather than individual payments to identified descendants, which would have been both genealogically complicated and culturally inappropriate given the communal nature of Crow land and resource relationships. The nation received a single allocation directed to the Standing Horse Cultural Preservation Fund, a new institution whose governing documents gave the Crow Nation full autonomy over its use and management. The fund was large enough to be genuinely consequential in its work, which was the preservation and teaching of Crow language, history, and cultural practice. Christine Stands Alone reviewed the final allocation figure in a meeting with Earl and said without effect that it was appropriate. Earl had learned enough by this point to understand that appropriate from Christine Stands Alone was as clear a statement of satisfaction as the meeting was likely to produce. He said good, she said yes. Raymond Minibears, who was present at that meeting, said something to Earl before they left the room that Earl wrote down afterward, because he did not want to lose the exact phrasing. He said, Standing Horse told his children that the stone on top was not a burial marker. It was a door left for someone patient enough to find it. He said, "You were patient enough." Earl said, "The stone was there when I got here. I just eventually stopped pretending it wasn't." Many bears considered this. He said, "That is also a kind of patience." Earl's own allocation under the framework was the portion of the authenticated value that remained after all descendant distributions, which, given the scale of the discovery and the proportional nature of the framework, was still a number that required sitting with. He sat with it several times across several weeks before it began to feel less like an abstraction and more like a real thing, with real weight and real responsibility attached to it. He paid off the banknote. He paid off the equipment lien. He paid off everything that had been acring against him for 11 years with the accumulated interest of difficult years and decisions made under pressure that always cost more than decisions made with room to breathe. The feeling of doing that was not dramatic. He had expected it to feel like release. It felt more like setting down something he had been carrying so long that the setting down was itself unfamiliar, that his hands and his back and his thinking did not immediately know what to do with the absence of the weight. He bought the combine. He bought it outright, new, without a lien or a payment plan or any arrangement with any dealer who held authority over its continued possession. He drove it home himself and parked it in the equipment shed and stood in front of it for a few minutes, in the way a man stood in front of a thing that represented something beyond itself. Lily came out of the house and stood beside him. She looked at the combine and then at him. She said, "Is it good?" He said, "Yeah, it's good." She said, "You look like you're going to cry." He said, "I'm not going to cry about a combine." She looked at him again. She said, "Dad." He said, "I'm fine." She said, "Okay." She took his hand, and they stood in front of the combine for another minute together, and he did not cry. But it was the kind of not crying that took some effort. The soil restoration work began in earnest that summer, under the direction of a consultant named Dr. Paula Reyes, who had spent her career working on agricultural land that had been damaged by the combination of drought and chemical dependency and monoculture that had characterized farming practice across the northern plains for decades. She walked Earl's fields in May and told him what she found in a conversation that was honest, in the way that conversations with someone genuinely good at their work tended to be honest, which was directly and without softening the difficult parts. She said the western parcels were worse than the preliminary assessment had suggested. She said restoring genuine productivity would take 5 to 7 years minimum and required a full transition in approach cover cropping rotation, reduction of chemical inputs, attention to soil biology rather than just soil chemistry. She said it was absolutely doable, and that she had seen worse come back to productivity, but that it required the kind of patience that was not available to a farmer who needed this year's yield to make this year's payment. Earl said, "I have time now." Reyes looked at him. She said, "Then let's do this right." They did it right. The western parcels were planted with a cover crop mix that fall for the first time in Earl's tenure on the land, legumes and grasses chosen for nitrogen fixation and organic matter contribution rather than yield. It looked like almost nothing from the road, low and varied, without the clean rows that farming was supposed to produce. Phil drove past twice in August and stopped both times to observe this, with the focused skepticism of a man watching someone he had already diagnosed make a confirming mistake. Earl let him observe. He did not stop what he was doing to explain it. The national attention generated by Rachel Torres's story had not disappeared in the way that news attention sometimes did when the next thing arrived. It had transformed instead into a slower, steadier kind of interest, the kind that lived in documentary proposals and academic journal articles, and the requests from universities that began arriving in Earl's email through the summer and into the fall. 2 separate history departments at Montana universities contacted Victor Chu about collaborative work on the collective holding documentation. A legal scholar at a university in Colorado wrote to Sandra Elliott about using the trust structure as a teaching case for historical property claims. A filmmaker who had previously made a documentary about homestead-era land fraud in the Dakotas reached out to Earl about the possibility of a feature-length film. Earl responded to all of these slowly and selectively, with Karen's help organizing the correspondence into categories of genuine interest versus attention that had no particular use for the people the story was actually about. He said yes to the university collaborations because they would produce scholarship that would make the historical record more complete and more accessible. He said yes to the legal scholar because he thought the trust structure should be studied and potentially used again. He said no to the filmmaker, not permanently, but not yet, because it felt early to put the shape of the story on film before the full story was complete. The most unexpected contact came from a retired railroad history archivist named Charles Drummond, who was 84 years old and lived in Helena, and had spent 40 years working for a university library before retirement, and another 20 years since working on a project he described in his letter to Earl as the documentation of land acquisition irregularities by Northern Plains Railroad interests between 1880 and 1920. He said he had been working on this project for 20 years and had compiled documentation of what he believed were systematic fraudulent land transactions affecting several hundred homestead families across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. He said the discovery at Earl's property was the first physical evidence he had encountered that corroborated what the documentary record suggested, specifically, that some families had been aware of and were actively organizing against the fraudulent acquisition practices. He asked whether Earl would be willing to meet with him and share access to the documents from the underground room for his research. Earl drove to Helena and spent a day in Charles Drummond's apartment, which was a space that had been entirely reorganized around the project. Bookshelves covering every wall, files, and organized stacks. A dining table that had not been used for dining in what appeared to be years. Drummond moved through this space with the careful deliberateness of a very old man who knew exactly where everything was, and needed that exactness because his body no longer permitted casual navigation. He showed Earl the documentary record he had assembled. Railroad company internal communications describing acquisition strategies. Legal correspondence from company attorneys advising on methods of applying financial pressure to homesteaders. Land transaction records showing the prices paid relative to assessed values. A consistent pattern of offers that range from insulting to fraudulent. Maps showing acquisition patterns that left certain parcels isolated and then surrounded. A documented strategy for forcing sales by making adjacent land inaccessible or unprofitable. Earl spent 4 hours with these documents and said very little. Then he looked at the map with his property's location on it and traced the pattern around it. The acquisitions that had moved through the county in the 1890s and early 1900s, like a wave, leaving the Hadley parcel as one of the few islands of independent ownership in a sea of railroad-controlled land. He said Thomas held out. Drummond said he did, and based on the internal railroad communications I have, he was actively advised by company agents to sell on at least 4 separate occasions and refused each time. He said after 1903, the communication stopped referencing his property. He said, "I believe the Boulder was a significant part of why the railroad abandoned their interest in the parcel. If they suspected a collective reserve existed on the property, the risk of a well-funded legal challenge would have changed their calculation." Earl sat with this. Thomas Hadley had not only protected the holding had protected Thomas Hadley's land, a deterrent that worked precisely because it was hidden and therefore represented an unknown risk to anyone who considered pressing a claim against the property. He said he was smarter than I gave him credit for. Drummond said most people from that era that history has forgotten were. He said that's why I've spent 20 years trying to remember them properly. Earl asked whether Drummond's research could be published in connection with the historical documentation from the underground room. Drummond looked at him with the expression of a very old man who has been working towards something for 20 years and has just been told it might arrive before he stops being alive to see it. He said that would be the completion of the project I've been working on since before you were a farmer. Earl said, "Let's make that happen." He connected Drummond with Victor Chu and the university historians who were already working on the archive, and the collaboration that resulted moved quickly in the way that work moved when the people doing it were motivated by something more than professional obligation. Drummond's railroad documentation, combined with the collective holding records, produced a historical picture of the settlement period in that county that was more complete and more damning of specific institutional actors than anything previously in the public record. The academic article that Victor Chu co-authored with 2 university historians and Charles Drummond ran in a peer-reviewed journal the following spring, under a title that Earl couldn't repeat from memory, but whose central argument he understood completely, that the collective holding at the Hadley property represented a documented example of multiracial, multi-ethnic organized resistance to railroad land fraud in territorial Montana, and that its physical survival constituted one of the most significant historical discoveries related to homestead-era economic rights in the Northern Plains. Drummond died 4 months after the article was published. He was 85 years old. His obituary mentioned the article and the collaboration, and Earl read the obituary 3 times the morning it appeared. Thinking about a man who had spent 40 years on a project because he believed the people in it deserved to be remembered properly, and who had managed to see that happen, he thought about what it cost to hold something for that long, and what it gave you to finally put it down completed. The trust distribution was formally completed in the 2nd October, after the discovery on a day that fell between the end of harvest and the beginning of real cold. That narrow window in the Northern Plains calendar, when the work of summer was done, and the work of survival had not yet fully resumed. It was a practical accident of timing, but it felt appropriate the way a lot of things had felt appropriate in ways that probably had more to do with attention than coincidence. Earl had resisted the idea of a formal event. He had said this to Karen early in the planning conversation, and she had listened and then said, "These families have been waiting 120 years. A room together is the minimum they deserve." He had thought about this and agreed that she was right, which she was. The event took place at the county fairgrounds, whose main hall was the largest indoor space in the county that belonged to the community rather than a commercial entity. Earl had been specific about that. He wanted a place that belonged to everyone, not a hotel ballroom or a corporate event space. The fairgrounds hall smelled like the fairs it had hosted, and the 4-H livestock shows and the community dinners, and the years of use that accumulate in wood and concrete when a building is genuinely used. It was not elegant, it was right. 31 of the 37 confirmed descendant families sent at least one representative. The 4 families whose trails had gone cold were represented by the framed ledger pages with their ancestors' names displayed on a table near the entrance, alongside a brief written history of what the archivists had been able to determine about each family, which in every case was more than their descendants had previously known. Agnes Yellowtail had died in July at 90 years old, which meant she was not in the room, but Raymond Minniebears was, and Christine stands alone, and Thomas Littlehawk and a group of young Crow Nation members who had come with the delegation and who moved through the room with the attentiveness of people who had been told this mattered and had come to understand for themselves why. Margaret Novak was there from Chicago. She had driven again, the same archival boxes in the back seat, a fresh thermos. She said she was thinking about moving to Montana. She said this to Karen, who said that would make the trust board meetings easier. Margaret laughed and said she had not thought about the board meetings as a reason to move anywhere, but that it was a reasonable point. Dale Kowalski came with his wife and his adult daughter and his teenage grandson, who was the age at which teenagers were generally performing disinterest in family events, and who was clearly not performing it here, looking around the room with the open attention of someone encountering something that had not been in their frame of reference before. Dorothea Renfroot came alone, as she did most things, and sat near the front with her hands in her lap, and the expression of a woman who had told a Christmas story for 8 decades, and was about to see it indifferently than she had expected when she started telling it. George Petrov drove from Missoula. Helen Szymanski was not present, but her granddaughter was, carrying a photograph of Helen and a letter Helen had dictated, and had her granddaughter read aloud when it was her family's turn to speak, which made the room go quiet, in a way that rooms went quiet when 93 years of waiting arrived at its destination, and everyone in the room understood that they were witnesses to that arrival. Phil was there because Phil was family, and because Karen had told him directly that he was coming. He sat in the back row and said nothing during the formal portions of the event, and afterward came to find Earl and stood in front of him for a moment, with an expression that was working through something complicated. He said, "I was wrong." Earl said, "You didn't know." Phil said, "I was still wrong." Earl said, "Yeah, you were." He said it without heat, as a fact that had lost its sting somewhere in the months between. He said, "But here we are." Phil said, "Here we are." They shook hands, which was the most demonstrative thing either of them did, and Phil went to find Karen, and Earl went back to the room. The formal program was simple, which had been Earl's insistence from the beginning. No speaker's bureau, no polished presentations, no sense that this was a performance of generosity, rather than the completion of a process. Each family representative who wished to speak had 2 minutes. The trust board spoke collectively for 15, explaining the distribution structure and the standing wave of the trust's ongoing work. Earl spoke last briefly and said mostly what he had been thinking for a year and a half, without having found the right occasion to say it all at once. He said that when he moved the Boulder, he was trying to find something to save his farm. He said he found something instead that saved his understanding of why the farm mattered. He said that Thomas Hadley had made a decision in 1887 to treat other people's resources with the same care he would have wanted his own resources treated, and that the 120 years the holding had been in the ground was not a failure of return, but a demonstration of what it looked like when a promise was actually kept. He said that the legal work and the historical work and the distribution that was happening today were not his accomplishment. They were the completion of something that 42 people, counting Thomas Hadley, had started in a time and under conditions that made what they did harder than most people in that room could fully imagine. He said, "What I did was move a rock and then try not to dishonor what was under it." He said, "I hope I've come close to that." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Dale Kowalski started clapping. Not the polite clapping of an audience, but the kind that started slow and built because the people doing it meant it. And the room came up with it. And even Dorothea Renfruit, who was not a person given to demonstrative gestures, put her palms together with the rest of them. Agnes Yellowtail had sent a message through Raymond Many Bears before she died, something she had asked him to deliver at the gathering if she was unable to attend. He read it in Crow and then in English, standing at the front of the room with the same unhurried dignity he had brought to every moment of this process. He read Standing Horse said to his children that what you put in the ground in good faith comes back with interest. He did not mean money. He meant that honesty compounds the same way debt does, and that if you planned it correctly, it outlasts you. The room was still for a moment. Then Many Bears folded the paper and said he was right. The distribution itself was not a public event. The financial transfers moving through the legal channels that Elliott and Elk Running had constructed over 15 months of careful architecture. Each family received their allocation according to the framework, along with a packet of documentation that included their ancestors' ledger entry, a copy of the historical research related to the collective holding, and a letter from Earl that he had written himself, without legal review, which Elliott had warned him against, and he had done anyway because some things needed to be personal. The letter said more or less what he had said at the gathering, but in the specific language of one person writing to another, acknowledging the specific name in the ledger, and the specific contribution, and the specific number of years between that contribution and this return. He wrote 37 versions, each slightly different, each with the ancestor's name and the family's particular detail. It took him 3 weeks to write them all, and Karen read each one when he finished and made occasional suggestions that were always right. He mailed the last one on a Friday afternoon in November, driving to the post office in town with the stack of envelopes on the passenger seat beside him. The post office was a building he had been going to his entire life, small and practical, and staffed by a woman named Diane, who had been there so long that handing her mail felt like an institutional transaction rather than a human one. He put the stack on the counter. She weighed and stamped them with the efficient indifference of her profession. He stood at the counter for a moment after the transaction was complete. Diane said, "Anything else?" He said, "No." He said, "That's everything." He drove home on roads he had driven so many times they required no attention, the fields on either side going pale and flat in the way of late November in that country, the sky doing its November thing, of coming down lower than it had any right to. He pulled into the farm lane and parked in front of the house, and sat in the truck for a minute before going in. The farm looked different than it had 2 November ago, which was the last November before the Boulder, the last November of the other version of his life. It did not look dramatically different. The house was the same house. The equipment shed held more equipment now and better maintained, and the combine was new. The fencing along the north pasture had been replaced where it had gone bad. The west parcels showed the low varied cover of the restoration planting, which from a distance was unremarkable, and from close up, if you knew what you were looking at, was evidence of a process that would show results in years rather than seasons. The boulder was still there. He had not moved it again. He had discussed moving it with Karen and with Lily and with Darren Pewitt, and the consensus had been that it stayed. It sat 12 feet from the entrance to the underground room, which was no longer sealed with a steel plate, but with a proper door fitted and framed by a carpenter Earl had hired in the spring to do it correctly. The door was good wood built to last, its hardware chosen with attention. It looked like what it was, the entrance to something that mattered, treated with the care that implied. He had thought about what to do with the underground room itself. Helen Marsh and Victor Chu had both raised the possibility of formal preservation as a historical site which had merit. The university historians had mentioned the educational value of access. The filmmakers, when they eventually came back, would certainly want to film it. All of these were real and reasonable interests. For now, he had left it mostly as it was, the shelving and the stone floor and the timbered ceiling, the dressed walls and the staircase with its notched treads, and the room's particular smell of old mineral air. The material was gone, properly documented and secured, but the room itself held the shape of what it had been, the proportions, and the careful construction of a man who had understood that things worth keeping required, being built to last. The door in the ground was unlocked. Anyone could go down. Earl had decided this without making a formal announcement of it, simply by leaving the door unlocked and accessible. The Hendersons' boy, Tyler, had gone down twice with his father. Darren Pewitt went down periodically, he said, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, but that seemed to involve wanting to be in the presence of something that had made a geologist feel things he usually kept carefully in their professional category. Lily went down sometimes after school. Earl had found her sitting in the underground room once, just sitting, not doing anything, not on her phone, just sitting in the space, with the portable light going and the stone walls around her. She had not heard him at the top of the stairs, and he had not called down. He had stood at the entrance for a moment, and then quietly walked away and let her have whatever she was finding in that room. Later that evening, he had asked her what she liked about it down there. She had thought about it for a moment and said, "It's like a place where time works differently." She said, "Everything up here is now. Down there, it's now, and before, at the same time." He had looked at her and thought about what it cost and what it gave you to have a child who could say a thing like that at 9 years old. He said, "Yeah, that's about right." She said, "Dad, do you think Thomas liked it down there?" He said, "I think he built it the way you build something you respect." She said, "Is that the same as liking it?" He said, "I think for some people it is." She nodded as though this confirmed something she had been working out and went back to whatever she had been doing before. The winter that followed was a good one, by the standards of good winters in eastern Montana, which meant it was hard, but not savage, predictable in its patterns, the kind of cold that tested the insulation of the house, and the maintenance of the equipment, and the patience of people who had chosen to live in a place that took the same things from you every year and returned them in different forms. Earl had always liked Montana winters, or at least accepted them with the particular respect he gave to things that required it. He felt this more clearly now. The winter was doing what the winter did, and he had what he needed to meet it, and the meeting of it had a shape and a purpose that the winter of 2 years ago had lacked. Karen had gone back to work in the fall, not because the money was necessary, but because she was a person who needed useful work the way the land needed water, and the absence of it had cost her something over the years of financial crisis that she was now recovering. She was working with a nonprofit in Miles City that did economic counseling for farm families in financial distress, which she had proposed to them and which they had accepted with the enthusiasm of an organization that needed exactly what she was offering and could not have afforded to hire it otherwise. She drove to Miles City 3 days a week and came home with the specific tiredness of someone doing difficult and necessary work, and the specific satisfaction of someone doing it well. Earl had known her for 23 years, and he recognized both kinds of tired in her. And the presence of the second kind in her face that winter was one of the things he was most grateful for in a year that had given him considerable things to be grateful for. Lily turned 10 in December and had a birthday party, the first real birthday party she had had in years, with actual friends from school, and a cake Karen made from scratch, and the Kowalski family's teenage grandson, whose name was Jake, who had been spending time at the farm periodically since the gathering, and had become something like a friend to Lily, in the way that children of very different ages sometimes became friends when there was enough common ground. Jake helped Earl with fence repair on 2 occasions, and turned out to have a useful eye for the kind of structural problems that didn't announce themselves until they failed. Earl told him so directly because he thought Jake was the kind of person who needed to hear honest assessment from adults rather than generic encouragement. Jake had said, not looking up from the wire he was stretching, that his dad had told him Earl was a man whose word meant something, and that he should pay attention to whatever Earl said. Earl said he was not sure he deserved that. Jake said his dad was pretty reliable about who he gave that assessment to. Earl thought about Dale Kowalski in his kitchen, sitting across from the ledger page with his great-great-grandfather's name on it, saying that Jan had trusted something and the trust had been honored. He thought about what it meant to inherit that story now, as a story that had a good ending, and whether that changed the shape of a family's relationship to trust as a practice. He thought it probably did. He thought it had changed the shape of his own. Spring came again, the second spring after the Boulder, and with it the beginning of the real evidence from the soil restoration work. The western parcels under Dr. Reyes's program were showing the first signs of biological recovery, things that were visible to trained eyes and invisible to untrained ones, but that Earl was learning to see. Earthworm density increasing, soil structure loosening, in the way that indicated microbial activity rather than compaction, the cover crop residue breaking down into organic matter at the rate Reyes had predicted when she outlined the program. She came out in April and walked the fields with him and said, with the careful understatement of someone who did not like to promise what agriculture had not yet delivered, that things were progressing as hoped. Earl had learned that from Reyes. Progressing as hoped was about as optimistic as she got until the crops were harvested and the numbers were in. So he took it as good news. The good news had a particular quality that year that was different from any good news Earl had received in recent memory, which was that it was deserved. The cover crop had been planted correctly, the restoration protocol had been followed, the patience required had been available because the financial pressure had been removed. The land was responding to being treated, while the way land responded when it was given the chance. Slowly but unmistakably, he stood in the western parcel on an April afternoon, when the light was coming down at an angle that made the low growth of the restoration cover look almost luminous, the particular gold green of new plant life against dark soil. And he thought about 5 generations of Hadleys on this ground, and what each of them had put into it and taken from it across the 140 years since Thomas had first broken sod here. He thought about what Thomas had understood about land, that Earl was still learning, that it had a nature that preceded and would outlast your claim to it, that the relationship between a person and their ground was not one of ownership, in the way lawyers and banknotes described ownership, but something more like stewardship, a responsibility to return more than you took when you could, and to be honest about what you owed it when you couldn't. He thought about the boulder, now sitting in its position 12 feet from the entrance to the underground room, where it would probably sit until some future Hadley, who had not yet been born, decided what to do with it. He thought about the marks on its underside, the cross and the surveyor's lines visible, now that it had been moved to anyone who came to look. He had brought Lily to see them in the first week after the discovery. She had crouched beside the boulder and traced the marks with her finger and asked whether Thomas had cut them. He had said, "I think so," or someone he trusted did it for him. She had said, "Why didn't he just leave a note?" He had said he left a letter, but letters can burn. Stone is harder to get rid of. She had sat with this for a moment. Then she had said he thought about what could go wrong. Earl had said, "Yeah, I think he spent a lot of time thinking about what could go wrong." She had said, "And still he did it." He had said, "That's usually how the right things happen." She had looked at the marks on the stone for another moment. Then she had stood up and taken his hand, and they had walked back toward the house in the late afternoon light, past the open door in the ground, and past the field that was going to take years to heal, and past the equipment shed with the new combine inside it, and past the kitchen window where Karen was visible, moving around doing something that involved the kind of focused domestic activity that meant dinner was in its intentional middle stages. He had thought walking toward all of that the particular shape of a life was not visible while you were inside it. You only saw it from enough distance to take the whole thing in. And the distance required was usually more than a single life provided, which was probably why it took him until 53 years old in a boulder in a field to understand something Thomas Hadley had known well enough to build a door in the ground for. Some things were not for the person who buried them. Some things were for the person who found them, which could not be predicted, and therefore required the faith that the right person would come, and the patience of dressed stone in dry earth, and the specific human decision to build something solid enough to outlast your knowing whether it worked. Thomas Hadley had made that decision. Earl stood in the field in April light and thought about the kind of faith that required, and thought about what it meant that the faith had been justified, and thought about what he owed to the justification. He thought about Lily, who would inherit this land, and everything that had happened on it, and everything that had been built beneath it, and everything that the history of it contained. The ledger, and the letters, and the underground room, and the boulder, and the trust, whose ongoing work would continue past Earl's tenure on the board, and require management from whoever came after. He thought about whether she was ready for that. He thought about a 10-year-old sitting alone in the underground room because she understood that it was a place where time worked differently. He decided she probably was. He walked back toward the house. The light was going golden at the edges of the afternoon, the way it went in that country, when the day was finishing its work, and the evening hadn't yet started its. The ridge to the east caught it and held it for a moment, the whole top line of it bright and clear against the beginning of dusk. He had grown up looking at that ridge every morning and every evening of his life in this place. He had seen it in every season and in every kind of weather, and from every state of mind that 40 years of living on this land had produced. He had looked at it in the mornings of the good years, when the wheat was up and the prices were reasonable, and the machinery was running, and everything that farming could be was being at least for a season. He had looked at it in the mornings of the bad years, when the prices were down, and the rain was wrong, and the debt was compounding, and the ridge to the east was just a feature of a landscape that was asking more than he had to give. He looked at it now, and it was the same ridge, the same shape against the same sky, the same sequence of contours he could have drawn from memory. And it was completely different, because he was completely different, and the land under his feet was completely different. Not in its soil or its geology or its history, but in what he understood about all three of those things, and what that understanding required of him going forward. He went inside. Karen looked up from the stove. She said, "How's the field?" He said, "Progressing as hoped." She smiled, which meant she had learned Reyes's vocabulary too. She said, "Good." She said, "Lily's doing homework." She said, "Dinner in an hour." He said, "Okay." He hung his jacket on the hook by the door and went to the kitchen table and sat across from Lily, who had a worksheet in front of her and a look of focused concentration that meant she was in the middle of something that required it. He said, "How's the homework?" She said, "Hard." He said, "Yeah." He said, "Need help?" She considered. She said, "Maybe in a minute." She was quiet for a moment, working through something on the page. Then she said, without looking up, "Dad, do you think we should put something on the boulder, like a marker?" He said, "What kind of marker?" She said, "Something that explains what it was, so people who see it know." He thought about this. A marker implied finality. The end of the stories need to be told, which was premature. The story was still in motion, still generating its consequences, still arriving at households where families opened letters and read their ancestor's name in a ledger entry and had to reorganize their understanding of where they came from. He said, "Not yet." He said, "The story isn't done." She said, "When will it be done?" He looked at his daughter, who was 10 years old and sitting in the kitchen of a house that had almost been lost and was now, in all the ways that mattered, found. He looked at her worksheet with its hard problems and her pencil and her willingness to ask for help in a minute when she was ready. He said, "I don't think this kind of story finishes." He said, "I think it just keeps going, and the people in it keep trying to do right by it." She looked up from the worksheet and looked at him directly, the way she did when she was assessing whether an adult was telling her the truth or the comfortable version of it. She said, "Is that okay?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "That's actually the good version." She nodded once, the nod of a child filing something away for later consideration, and went back to her homework. He sat across from her at the table in the house, on the land that had held its faith across a century and a quarter, and he thought that Thomas Hadley had not been trying to leave a fortune. He had been trying to leave a practice, the practice of treating other people's trust as something that did not expire because it became inconvenient. The practice of keeping a promise even when the original promiser was gone and the original need had been forgotten, and all that remained was the structure built to honor both. The practice of building solid things and trusting them to the future. He had left a fortune too. But that was the consequence, not the point. Earl thought he finally understood the point. Outside, the ridge went dark against the last of the evening sky. The field settled into whatever field settled into at the end of the day's light. That particular stillness that was not quite silent, but close to it. The sound of a place that had been worked hard, and was now resting, and would be ready again in the morning. The boulder sat in the dark where it had been moved to. The door in the ground was unlocked. Some things endure because the people who built them understood that endurance was not an accident. It was a decision made again and again by each person who came into contact with it, and chose to keep faith with what it represented. Earl Hadley was one of those people now. He was trying to be worthy of it. He thought he was getting close. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.